Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time again. You're here to learn more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, and in today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at FileMaker's internal IDs. Why do you need to even know about them? Well, stick with me and we'll find out in just a few. Alrighty. So let's learn some more about FileMaker Pro. Now, this maybe it won't be. It may seem like a very dry lesson, but guess what? The information that I'm going to give you in today's video is so cool and so critical that I just love it. This is one of my most favorite aspects of FileMaker. Yet, it's one of the last things or one of the things that you stumble upon or find out about later on when you're developing. As a new FileMaker learner, I just love having this information. So let's get right into it. What we're talking about are FileMaker's internal IDs. Now, first off, I need to mention I'm recording this video using FileMaker 16, but most of what we cover will work with much older versions. In fact, we'll find out a version as old as FileMaker 6 if you want, but it'll work with newer versions as well. Also, if you are interested, you found out that this video, you did a YouTube search, you found this video and you were wondering, how do I get to video 1 or video 5? How do I take these in sequence? Click on the channel icon. It's the one with the logo for my channel here. That'll take you to my channel page, and there you'll be able to find all of the playlists and be able to follow these videos in sequence if you'd like. Also, in the description below this video, you will be able to find the file that we're going to be using to follow along, and it happens to be called TimeTrack. We've been creating a time tracking database, something super simple, although it's getting more and more complex, and as I mentioned, today we're going to take a look at FileMaker's internal IDs. Now, in order to do that, we need to go to FileMaker's Documentation. Now, I'm going to switch over to an application that I like to use on the Macintosh called Dash because it allows me to quickly search the FileMaker Documentation. You probably won't have a copy of this, but if you do search for FileMaker, unless you go purchase Dash and then download FileMaker's Documentation, which, by the way, if you're interested, can be done by this, you simply go to this area in Dash, if you're using Dash, to user contributed information. It will load. You scroll down, and down in the sections of the F, you will find FileMaker Pro 16. Thank you very much, Jason P. Scharf, for actually providing the FileMaker documentation for Dash. There's also an equivalent application that you can use. I believe I did a video about this in the environment section. Again, go to the channel website and you'll be able to find that. But long story short, what we are trying to take a look at are all of FileMaker's internal IDs. Now you can see I have loaded these by simply typing in IDs here and searching for, within FileMaker's documentation, for all of the different references to IDs. So if we take a look at field IDs, we look at table IDs, layout IDs, they're all just a representation of what FileMaker uses internally from the point in time that you create a FileMaker field or FileMaker file. This includes script IDs and value list IDs. Now, if you've been watching this series, you know that one of the things that I heavily promote is that you do not use sequential numbers as your primary key values because they don't really allow, they prohibit two different things. One of them is very easy and fluid syncing. If you're going to do any type of synchronization by taking a FileMaker database offline and allowing to synchronize that data, you just can't do it with sequential numbers. It won't work. You have to use unique IDs or UUIDs. Also, if you're doing an upgrade process, which in the development world happens like this, there's development, then they call it staging, then they call production. So it's primarily a 3-stage process where you develop something, then you stage it just before you're going to start to use it for production, then you put the database into production. Well, in that staging to production process with FileMaker, if you use regular serial numbers, you have to go in and update all of those serial numbers when you take a database from staging to production, or from development to production, if you skip staging, and that causes problems. You have to write a script that will automate the updating process, etc. Well, after explaining all of that, go figure that FileMaker, from the very first time that a FileMaker file is created, it starts to assign sequential numbers to everything internally. That includes for fields, tables, layouts, scripts, value lists, and records. Now, what's really nice about knowing these things is that this ID is absolute and it never changes. So if we take a look at our FileMaker file, and if, for example, as I hide my documentation here, and one thing I wanted to point out was, notice that this was actually released in FileMaker 6. So a long time ago, before FileMaker even became relational with FileMaker 7. Now, there was a developer that latched onto this. The first person that I know of that did this was a gentleman named Fabrice Nordman. And what he did, as I hide this, and I switch over to Safari, we're going to be doing a lot of just learning about how this works. First off, he took this approach and understood that when you rename things in FileMaker, the reason that FileMaker is so flexible with its renaming, if you change the name of a field or the name of a table occurrence or the name of a script, it doesn't matter. If you change the name behind the scenes fluidly, FileMaker just changes everything and updates it because of these internal IDs. It's what makes FileMaker so flexible. But if we know about these internal IDs, we can develop some really cool things. So we're on a page right now that we are at support.filemaker.com. Now, the reason that I want you to know about this page, and of course you can go to this page, we need to know how to search FileMaker Support. I'm just going to take off the remainder of that domain and just go to the core support web page, because we need to know how to look for things, especially if you ever want to become FileMaker certified. In the search area here, what we're going to put is technical specifications. Now, I already have that right there, and we can limit it to the version that we're working with. I'm working with 16 as the recording of this video, but if you have older versions, you can use them as well. So I'm going to specify 16, do a search, and then as that comes up, I'll scroll down. Let's see, is it not going to show me those? Thank you for not showing that. I'm going to go back to it in my history just because I don't want to take the time to fumble through FileMaker's search and why it doesn't work sometimes. Long story short, we're trying to get to this page right here where we can take a look at some of the boring things about FileMaker. Now, hopefully, I'm going to make this non-boring, because as we scroll down, we get to a lot of really interesting things. Number of fields of columns per record. 256 million total fields per record. Let's get to something. Number of tables per file, 1 million. You'll never create 1 million tables. But it's interesting to know that internally, FileMaker is creating these IDs and they're constantly moving them forward. 64 quadrillion records. And it goes on and on in terms of the total number of things that can be created. Now, all of these stats are great. They're impressive. Quadrillion is a number that you aren't going to hear too often. Yeah, you'll hear it often when you're in database development. But what we are interested in is knowing how this helps us out when we're developing in FileMaker as a FileMaker learner. We're going to take a look at the website of fmfunctions.com. At fmfunctions, this is where the first occurrence that I know of a particular function, which is called fm name ID. Now, a little bit obscure because you really don't know what you're getting out of this custom function, and we're going to see how it's been simplified by another developer, Jeremy Bonte. But what this did is this takes advantage of those functions that we saw in the help. It takes advantage of these field IDs, these table IDs, layout IDs, and script IDs. Now, the reason for this is when we know that we can use these internal IDs, we can associate them to systems that we put, or features that we put into our FileMaker database. One of the features that we're going to be adding into our time tracking database is the ability to track notes. Notes, one of the most common things that you add in a FileMaker system. In fact, probably so common that you may be just adding a single field called notes. But would you like to know that you can use a note system that will allow you to have notes for as many different tables in your FileMaker solution using these internal IDs, because you're associating notes to specific tables? And that's what we're going to do. So let's move forward. Here we have, as I switch to this, and if you'd like, I'll put these in the description. I need to remember to copy these into the description so that you can access them here on YouTube. But I'm going to a very popular open source management website called GitHub, where people can store all kinds of code. Now we're at jbonte, which is Jeremy Bonte's username. FileMaker Techniques, Tree, Master. You don't need to remember all of this because I'll have the link in the YouTube description. But long story short, I've said that 2 times now. I guess I like that one. We're taking a look at these custom functions, table ID and table name from ID, because we want to see something about FileMaker's internal IDs. Now, just because I say FileMaker uses internal IDs for things, FileMaker doesn't always start at the number 1 for IDs. It does for scripts, and it does for fields, and we can take a look at that, but we are mostly interested at table ID because we want to build something really cool into our FileMaker system. So I'm going to click on this table ID, and here on GitHub, I can always click this raw value. And raw is just going to take me to a blank page where I can select into this web browser, do a Command or Control A, select everything, copy it, and then go put it into my file as a custom function. So I will do that now here and switch over to FileMaker. I'm going to then go to my Manage, go to my Custom Functions, and I'm going to create a new custom function. I'm going to paste that custom function here, and the wonderful thing about the, if you put the name of the custom function within a comment in your custom function, all you have to do to add that is simply copy the values and add them to the custom function, which is what I'm doing now. Table ID, so forth. Not file, I accidentally copied file and pasted that into the function when what I wanted to do was I wanted to copy, paste, and then there we go. So we have our custom function table ID. What's the file that you want to get the table ID? This is the internal ID. And what's the table name? Now here again is where FileMaker uses the names of table occurrence and table name interchangeably. In fact, Jeremy has followed this through with this function, but once we have this function into our system, we're going to be able to see the internal IDs of tables. So how do we see that? Let's go into Define Database. On the relationship graph, the name of the table occurrence is what is expected in this situation. So this is where FileMaker uses them interchangeably, table occurrence. Most of the time when it's asking for a table occurrence name, that's what it's thinking is the table name when it asks for a table name. Because FileMaker, for some reason, their documentation, they don't clearly distinguish between table occurrence and table. So if I have a table occurrence name named layout double chevron time, and it simply points to the time table, when it asks for a field, a table name in the function, it doesn't want the table name of time. It wants the table occurrence name of layout time. It's just something that's happened over FileMaker's growth because of the documentation. So I'm going to double click this, and I'm going to copy this table occurrence name, knowing that that's the name that we want in the function. And I will close this dialog box out. Now again, FileMaker Advanced is extremely useful if you're learning FileMaker because it allows you to use the data viewer, and the data viewer allows us to use that custom function without having to create an actual FileMaker function. So here in the watch, I can use this watch area to create a FileMaker calculation in order to look at anything. I am going to use this one right here and start to type in table ID. Now, how do we distinguish? Well, right there, we can see that that is an internal FileMaker function. That is my custom function. Table IDs is what FileMaker returns, a list of all IDs of all tables. Table ID, my custom function, is going to allow me to just list a specific ID of a table. So the table name. So again, it's not the table name time, it's the table occurrence name. And I'm going to put that in quotes. I have it on my clipboard. It's the name of the table occurrence that I took. The file. Now I could specify a separate FileMaker file if this FileMaker file was connected to another file. If I just want to use this file anytime in both FileMaker's functions and in this suite of custom functions, I can just put a double set of quotes. And what is implied is the current file. Now look at what happened. There's an ID number. This is the sequential number that belongs specifically to this table occurrence, and it may be referencing the underlying table. We can always see that by looking at another table occurrence that's based on the same base table. So let's go do that. I'm going to copy this and put it into this as a comment. Always a good way to be able to save things if you want to come back and change the function. Let's go see if we can find another table and see if the IDs are the same with regards to the table ID going through the table occurrence. I know this is boring. Trust me, we're going to add a cool feature. Let's go back into our defined database. I'm going to select my table occurrence of my layout time, see if there's any other table occurrences that are the same by selecting the tables with the same source code. I've got a number of them. I've got layout time 2 and filter time. So I can pick any one of these other 4 in order to verify and see that the ID is the same. Let's pick filter time. I'll copy that table occurrence name, say OK. We'll go back to my data viewer, and we will double click, and we're going to replace this table occurrence name. It's slightly different. So that gives us a clue. FileMaker is not returning the ID specific of the table. It's returning the ID specific to the table occurrence. Now here's the cool thing. What do we know about the table occurrences in terms of how users interact with our FileMaker solution? Those table occurrences are tied to the layouts that users interact with. So it's very specific to the viewpoint that the user has when they're dealing with a layout, because that one layout that the user interacts with can only be tied to one table occurrence. So now let's go build in our cool feature. All right, that was a lot of buildup, but it was only 15 minutes, thereabouts, for us to learn about that really cool feature. All right, so now we're going to build in a nice feature. Let's hide the Safari behind here, and let's take a look at our reference database, my time tracker. Now, in this database, when I started creating it for the purpose of just tracking my own time. We're not going to do that in our main database because we're going to put in multi-user features, everything that we can think of that makes this a good multi-user database. If you wanted to use it for punch cards, time cards, tracking your own time, it should be able to be modified for that. Well, over here, one of my requirements was, as I was doing work, or as I do consulting development work, I have internal notes that are specific to me that I will put in relative to my team. But I also have a client summary, things that a client wants to know, okay, what's the work that you did and why am I being billed for this? So those two distinctions dictated that I needed two different fields. We're going to do things a little bit differently in this database because I want to teach you how you can use this internal ID in order to tie notes. Not just notes that you put into one field, but notes that we put into a dedicated notes table that can store notes for any other table. That means if you have a system where you have invoices, customers, companies, job quotes, bids, whatever tables you are storing data in, you don't have to have a separate notes table for each of those associated tables. You can have one single notes table and track and store notes in that notes table for all of the different types of entities in your FileMaker solution. And this is a cool thing to know about because it's dealing with a flexible key. So let's go create our notes system. Here in our managed database, we need to create a new table. Now we know that we're going to be tracking notes. So as I scroll this out, let's make the window actually a little smaller. And we will type in notes and we will create the new table. We've got our new table of notes. We need our defaults, which we always take. Those end up being our UUID, our modification and creation values or creation fields. I simply copy them, go over to my notes, and I now click and paste. Great, I have those. Now I want to have a single note field, whatever the note is. I could put notes, I'm just going to put note. Now, what I'm going to put in is a very special type of key. Most of the time when you're connecting one table to another table, you're doing it based on a dedicated primary key. So in this scenario, for the notes table, its dedicated primary key is ID. And it's the same in all my FileMaker systems because when you use ID, the same name across all tables, it's super easy to distinguish. So this is a notes ID, the primary key absolutely specific to this particular note. But because in this notes table, we're going to be storing notes for many different related tables, let's say it was for a customers table or for a invoices table, I wouldn't create a foreign key for all of the different types of tables that I wanted to have. In other words, I wouldn't create an ID customers so that I could relate notes to the customers table and then also create an ID invoices and then be able to relate to that particular foreign key. And then let's say quotes, and in my particular situation, ID times, where I'm tracking individual times. I'm not going to do that, although you can. It's very possible to have multiple foreign keys in order to relate from all of those different entities into notes. But it's still just a key. And what we've learned today in the first 15 minutes is we learned that FileMaker has an internal ID that absolutely identifies a table occurrence. So why don't we use that in conjunction with a key value and not necessarily care where the key value comes from? Because what identifies where the note should be associated to is that table ID, that absolute unique ID. So what we're going to use is we are going to use a key value called ID any, meaning it can be a foreign key from any other table in our whole system. That means that this ID any foreign key will be able to have the primary key from customers, invoices, time, quotes, whatever. It really makes this table sort of a one solution fits all for all of the different places that I might want to have notes. And I don't have to build multiple note systems into my solution. I'm just building one note system that accommodates all of the things that I'm tracking. So as I get rid of this comment and we create this ID any, there's one other field that we need, and that is our foreign key of the ID. And the ID is going to be this, ID table. In other words, what table or what perspective in my FileMaker solution does this associate to? Now, there's one downside to what we're doing right here. This is very FileMaker centric. If you're developing a FileMaker system where you're going to take data out of this system and maybe export it to a SQL system or export it for the purpose of somebody else to have a comma separated value or an export file, you're going to need to use additional classification on these notes to know what they belong to. Maybe you might create a field of note type, whether it belongs to a customer or whether it belongs to an invoice, etc. We are doing something that's very FileMaker specific, meaning you're planning on staying in FileMaker and not necessarily going out to an external system. All right, this can be a number field because FileMaker uses a constantly incrementing number field for all of the objects that it creates. So we will create that. So what we have now is we have a super flexible system, and all we have to do is wire it up. So we go to our relationship graph, and we take our notes. Again, FileMaker creates the default. I happen to double-click it and say that's going to be a developer table. Just shove it up there, what FileMaker creates. I will select these. I'm going to use the Option key to Option arrow to move them down without actually having to drag them. It keeps them in alignment, which is nice. I'm now going to wire up my notes that I want to be able to track, and this allows me to obviously create as many notes as I want. This isn't just a single notes field where I type in some notes and then I lack the features that I might want for notes, such as an automatic timestamp on every note, who created the note, the ability to create unlimited notes, the ability to come in from the other direction, come in how many notes are there on a particular time record. Or for you in your database, maybe you want to see how many invoices have 5 notes or more. Is that a problem customer? I mean, that is a metric that you can use in your FileMaker system. Wherein, as a FileMaker learner, if you just put just a regular notes field, do you know how many times notes have been made about a particular invoice? I don't know, might be helpful. So we wire it up by creating a duplicate of the table occurrence. We'll double click in order to reassign this to notes. And do I have a prefix that I want to use? I won't use one for right now. We're going to get to cleaning this up and renaming it. But this is a really easy thing now. That ID field takes any ID from any primary key. So I want to put the primary key of the time into the ID any. Now, what do I need in order to get the table ID wired up in there? That's where I'm going to need that extra field, but it's a field that has very little consequence. Again, I could do this. I should do this probably from the globals if I wanted to. I'll wire it up for right now directly. Let's go ahead. Let's do it from the globals and see if it works. I'm doing this live, so I don't know. I haven't tested this, but I'm going to put this in my globals because it seems like the best place to do this in order to create notes. And through the relationship, I will be able to create the notes. So again, it's ideal if I only have to put this table ID once in any given location. Putting it into the globals allows me to put it in one place and automatically have it determined based on its context. Otherwise, I would have to put an unstored calculated field in all of the different tables where I might want to do notes. This is one of the advantages of using that separated globals table. So let's zoom in and make that particular note. Zoom in right here and zoom out a little bit. And we will put in a key value called simply table ID. And I'll put in the underscore. Table ID. This is going to be a calculated field. And it's going to be unstored. We're going to create that. We are going to use the table ID custom function. The file that we want to get this from is from this file. Now here comes the tricky part. We do want it to be a number. We will set our storage options after we set the field, of course. Context. We're always thinking about FileMaker's context. What is our context when we're working on a current layout? This wants a table name, and actually what it wants is a table occurrence name. Let's take a look at some of the features that we have. Starting, all of your environment variables are from get functions, so go back and watch the the environment series of videos if you want to learn about the environment functions. Let's start to type get layout. There's an interesting one. Get layout table name. That could be useful. In fact, it is. So this table ID wants to know what is the table name that you want to create, or what you want the ID from. Well, if I use my immediate context when I'm on a given layout using the get layout table name and pass that into the table ID, lo and behold, what's going to happen is when I move from layout to another layout, that ID is going to be different. And we're going to take a look at that. So storage options, we do not want to store this. We want it to be unstored. Anything in our globals table is either going to be unstored or global. We don't want anything that could potentially be stored into the record on the server. It's all memory type of information. So now we can go check this out. Let's take a look at this. Let's see if this works. Now we already know from a previous lesson that this globals table doesn't have to be connected in order to be shown on a layout. We have a layout that is based on this table occurrence, and we have a layout based on this table occurrence. We're going to go put that global field on both of them and see if it actually is different. And it should be. We'll go into layout mode. I don't have any records here. Let's create a new record just so we can see what's going on. I'm going to drag a copy of a field. I'm going to switch my context to my globals field. I'm going to see, I want to look at my table ID. I'm going to copy this from globals. I'm going to go into browse mode. Do not save my layouts. I will zoom out. I will hide my tracker. I will show my manage layouts, and I want to look at my startup because I want to prove to myself that it will be different on each of the layouts. And I will paste right here. I'm double clicking the field in order to ensure the context. It is coming from the globals. And let's see what happens. Unrelated table. That one won't show. This one will show. Let's just temporarily wire it up so that we can get it to show. In this case, the reason that it's probably not going to show and it's showing an unrelated table is because it's a calculation that's unstored as opposed to a global field. If it was a global field, then the global field would probably show the data. Unfortunately, for this exercise, it's not. We're going to simply wire one up. I'm just going to take a duplicate of my globals and temporarily wire it up, and it doesn't matter what type of wiring I use here to connect it. I'm going to double click, and because I'm going to destroy this, I just want to see it in action and see if it will show me that table ID. Refresh, unrelated, there we go, click. Okay, so is it, oh, it is. That is so cool. Hopefully, the wheels are turning right now as we're coming close to 30, and we'll wire up this last thing. But the wheels are turning now. What I've just put into this system is I've put in a system where I have one single notes table. That one single notes table can take a foreign key from any other table. Customers, invoices, quotes, time, jobs, billing, you name it. That one notes table is going to be able to store individual notes for all of these different objects. But now I'm tying the notes specifically to a given view in my FileMaker database. So in other words, the notes that I make on a particular time record are going to only show for that time record for that ID of that record. If I made notes in this case, and it wouldn't make sense, for the startup table, it would pull those notes out of the notes table and only be specific to this particular layout, or any layout tied to that specific table occurrence. And again, the only downside to this whole system right now is the fact that it's very FileMaker centric because we're using this internal ID that uniquely identifies this table. And that's what we're going to do, wire it up. So let's go in and get rid of our mess. I only added that just so that I could see it. Delete the relationship, delete the table occurrence. Let's wire up our, let's wire it up here through the ID any. I'm not going to be able to get that ID. I am going to have to wire up a graph. That's what I was afraid of. That's all right. We'll do it temporarily and then we'll fix it. Somewhere down the road, we could make it so that it would work through the globals. Great thing about FileMaker, you can always make it work the way that you want it to work. If I only wanted to have one global field, I could do that. In this scenario, for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to do it, so I'm going to wire this up really quickly by going to the globals, simply copying this field, switching over to my time just so I can wire it up. It's a little bit of a kludge right now. Typically, I don't want to, I want to try to avoid, if I can, commingling this global unstored calculation, but we're going to do it here just so that I can wire things up. We'll add it to the relationship by saying We now want to wire up the table ID to the ID table. We want to add that, and we now have a multi-predicate key that uniquely identifies records. We do want to turn on the ability to create records on this relationship, the ability to create notes. And what I have now is a note system that is tracking notes specifically to a given timestamp, but then also specific to this viewpoint in the whole of my FileMaker solution. And it would be very easy to see this in action. We go over to our layout right here, notes, which FileMaker created for us. We open that up. We switch to our table view because we like to see things added into FileMaker as we add them. I'll hide that particular layout. And again, FileMaker, in order to create a related record through a relationship, the bare minimum is that it only requires the field. As soon as you want to add more than one related record, then you're going to need a portal, of course. So I'm just going to do this a simple way and put the field on the layout and look at my notes, which I need to rename that table occurrence. I'm going to select the note, which is where I want the content to go in this particular case. I do know that the allow create related records is turned on for me. I go into browse mode, and what I should see is here behind the scenes, a brand new record should populate when I create a new note. And click out, which causes the commit, which there it is. There is my new note that was created. It's got its own unique ID, as we can see. It's got the note right here. We'll drag that to the beginning. We need to go into layout mode and add we've got the ID any. Let's actually take the time to realign these. I'd like to move and again, I showed this in a previous video where if you want the default order of a table view to be in a certain order, rearrange the fields, go into browse mode, because I want to see the ID first, then maybe my note, then my ID any, then my ID table, just because I like to see the key values. Go into browse mode, right click right here, go to my table view, and we can barely see it. It's cut off. I won't zoom in, zoom out, but it's reset. It'll reset this layout to the order in which I've arranged the key values. So there's my ID, there's my note, there's the foreign key, which as I zoom out a little bit, 752C matches 752C, perfect. And there's my qualifier right there. The internal ID that associates this note specifically to this view of the data. So that's today's lesson. 7 minutes over. 30 minutes, we covered a lot of awesome content. Now, obviously, I've only gone into one of all of the different ID functions. When I put the IDs in the comments into YouTube here, and you go to Jeremy's functions, now one of the advantages, I forgot to mention that, one of the advantages of Jeremy's individual functions over Fabrice's original single function is with a single FileMaker custom function, you have to know what needs to be passed in terms of what it expects. So this very obscure TLSFV stands for Table Layout Field Script Value List, I believe. Whereas with Jeremy's functions, it's a different thought process in terms of functions. The function name itself is very descriptive. What do you want to return? I want to return the layout ID. I want to return the script ID or the value list ID. So I suggest, as a matter of something to do for homework, if you want to play around, is copy the layout ID and the layout number name from ID, copy those into the file, and then just pass in what it expects, which it will expect a file name, which you can put blank, just double quotes, and then put the name of the layout. And the cool thing about this is this word right here, all you have to do is select the cursor in front of it, just type the word get, add a parenthesis, and then put a parenthesis after this, and you automatically have the internal function that FileMaker uses for get the layout name, or get layout name. Actually, you have to take off the word the. But it's a great way to look at what's happening with FileMaker in terms of IDs. So for example, this layout in layout mode is probably layout ID number 1 or number 2, depending on when I created the splash screen. If I delete this layout, and it's layout ID number 2, that ID goes away forever. Layout ID number 2 will never ever be in this file for the lifetime of the file. And granted, I can create millions upon millions of layouts, but one astute developer out of probably 10 will ask, okay, that's great, Matt, but what happens when I go to my file menu and I choose save a copy as, and that comes up, and I choose a clone with no records or a compacted copy? Doesn't that reset the IDs? The answer is no, it does not. There is a myth out there, even with a lot of advanced FileMaker developers. In fact, if you're just now learning FileMaker and you say, if you ask an advanced FileMaker developer, let's say you ask 10 of them, you say, if I'm using FileMaker's internal IDs to wire things up with some of my relationships, will FileMaker reset those when you save a copy of the file as a clone? And a lot of them might say, yes, don't use internal IDs. That's not true, and I'm here to debunk that myth. FileMaker, even when you save a clone or a copy, always moves the IDs forward. That's for scripts, for everything. From the point in time that a file is created, any copy that is saved from that original file will not replace older IDs that have been removed. Deleted scripts, that ID for that script will never come back. Deleted layouts, deleted table occurrences, always moving them forward. All right, that was a jam-packed lesson. Hopefully, it was not too dry in the beginning before we got to the point where we learned that we can start to use IDs in order to absolutely identify things. And one of the things that I do that we'll see in another video is the way that I reference going to layouts is I use FileMaker's internal IDs for layouts when I want things to be dynamic. And it's a great way to program. It's a little bit complex, but hopefully our primer here in terms of these internal IDs will help us out. We will also learn that FileMaker has a get function. You can look it up, of get record ID, and that is a constantly incrementing serial number that uniquely identifies each record. And that also is the same as all of the rest of the IDs in the design functions. So let's see if we've got any questions for this particular video before we head out here. Let's hide Safari in the background there, and I will open up my chat. All right, so we've got relational. Any questions? There's an absolute limit for a FileMaker style. Yes, there is an absolute, but it's something like, I don't know. Look at the specs on that page that we took a look at. It's crazy, crazy. Question, what is the proper way to name two files located on different servers but have the same name? Does it involve data source? Two files, same name. I think if they're on two separate servers, you can have a file with the same name, although you'd have to clarify why you might want to use the same name on them. That makes it very difficult when you use the same name. In fact, a lot of programming world, if you are going to use, instead of using a number for uniquely identifying something, it's just like usernames on Twitter. You can never have two of the same username. You almost always have a different name, and the term, as far as I'm aware, that they call that is a machine name. So whenever you're going to identify using something that uniquely identifies something, and it's not UUID, and it's not an incrementing serial number, you use a machine name, which means I can't have any other copies of the same name. So you'll have to clarify that. Jean-Pierre, maybe email me. Isn't it better to use IDs instead of names, just in case you want to change a field or a table name? It is. Everything that we wire up in our FileMaker solutions, if we can do it based on numbers, and then just say, what does this number represent? That's infinitely better. And it is pervasive throughout all of life for all of us. How does the government identify you? With a number. How does the driving authority, whoever issues your driver's license, how do they identify you? With a number. All they do is they associate a name to that number. And we want to do the same thing in our FileMaker database systems. So when you start to track data, if you notice that you're using human readable names, think about whether or not you can replace that with a number and find out a way that you can show the human readable name, but use the number behind the scenes. All right, your primary application of this is for dynamic navigation. Yes, you can use for the purpose of layout IDs. If you want to be able to create a button, that button determines where it should go based on some other data, I can go to a layout by number. You can do it by name, but the problem is when you're writing scripts in FileMaker, you're writing the value of the layout name within a set of quotes. And as soon as you make something a literal value in a set of quotes, and you do that all throughout the rest of your FileMaker solution, you now have to go do like a global find and replace. Because the second that you change the name of that layout, and you've used FileMaker's go-to layout by name function, and you typed in the name of the layout is customers with an S, and you're sitting there and you're programming and you think, no, customers doesn't work. I'd like to call them clients. And you go rename that layout of clients, guess what broke? What broke was your script step that says go to layout by name, and in quotes, it still says customers. It broke because you renamed the layout to clients. Now, FileMaker is very flexible and will allow you to rename a layout from customers to clients. And if you're using FileMaker's go-to layout and you've selected the layout itself, internally, FileMaker is using an ID. But if you want to use FileMaker's dynamic features, such as go-to layout by name, here's a variable name that comes in by a variable. Using the name of the layout when you can change the name causes you to write code that breaks, and that's not cool. But if we use FileMaker's internal IDs, which don't change, and we say go to this layout by ID, which FileMaker doesn't have, I'll have to show you how to actually map the ID to the layout number, then that never breaks. And it feels so good when you're developing a FileMaker solution and you know that the code that you create can't actually get broken. All right, so I think that is a good wrap for this video. 46, only a few minutes over 30, so we're good. All right, thank you, those of you that check into these videos live. And if you're watching this after the fact, then of course you can, well, if you're watching it live, you can subscribe here on YouTube. Click the little bell and you'll get notified as well. And the next video in this series will come up right here, and you're always welcome to check out FileMakerMagazine.com, where I've got more in-depth articles with really cool techniques. So, until next time, much luck with your database development and happy FileMaking.